Robert Cappuccio, I'm so happy to see you.
Good to be here, Natania.
Yeah, I know you're speaking a lot, you're working a lot with clients, and I'm really thrilled to be able to highlight you on this podcast because, you've been a huge part of my journey and continue to be. I've known you for well over 20 something years, and you were a key
Wow.
contributor. Yeah, right. And you were really key in helping me get started on my journey to health and wellness. So I'm glad that, people have access to you now. And I want more people to, because you really break it down really well. The first question I had for you is I was looking at your website, the self-help antidote. Where did this originate, and what does that mean to you? What is that?
It originated from my own cantankerous personality flaws and things that really piss me off.
Got it.
As most of my interests do. And for me, the self-help antidote is not about having a go at self-help, because there are some great educators and there's great information coming out of that industry. But there's also a lot of assumptions coming out of that industry. And there are things that when you look at the empirical evidence, not only does it not drive transformation the way it claims to, I think it creates unnecessary barriers. So for me, the self-help antidote is a fancy way of talking about coaching-based culture between people, between organizations. And coaching is not really about you, the guru, having the answers. Or as my friend Dr. Roy Sugarman is fond of saying, it's not about being the sage on the stage, but rather the guide by the side.
Hmm.
And that was the motivation for launching the self-help antidote.
So when I originally met you, you were very into self-help books. You exposed me to many of them, which were really great. And when I say self-help books, originally I started, as a personal trainer. You were the head of education, and you really, moved me to read these books on, developing, I guess, yourself, believing in yourself. A lot of it branched out into sales, into communication. Um, so you don't agree with these books anymore? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think they're very valuable.
Okay.
I just think that the industry, whilst it has a lot of valuable information, works on the premise that, and this is not a universal statement,
Correct.
but there's a lot of resources that say, well, I have the answer. So if you would be more like me and a little bit less like you would stop struggling. Because the reason why there's disparity between what you say you want and what you actually do is because, and there goes the fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error in psychology is where you give yourself the benefit of the doubt. I'll give you a scenario.
Good.
I consider myself to be extremely self-accountable, dependable, reliable. But when I show up 25 minutes late to a meeting, I'll say something like, well, that's because the traffic patterns on the 5 were intense. I mean, for the past 10 years, I've been living in this area and traffic has been absolutely brutal, but I wasn't expecting that today. So it was beyond my control. But when you do the same thing, it's like, well, you obviously don't care about promises. You don't care about punctuality. You're lazy. You're disrespectful. And there's all these overarching assumptions that come with someone's behavior. So you associate their discrepancies as being the result of an attribute, an internal attribute that they lack. And of course, you possess. But when you show the same discrepancies between what you're saying and what you're actually doing, you're far more forgiving. And not only does that have gaps in reality, you really don't know what's going. You're a fan of Stephen Covey's books.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Do you remember the story in The 7 Habits where he was talking about he was on a subway early in the
Absolutely.
morning on a Saturday, and being that me and you have been on a subway early morning on a Saturday, we're
We
both
have.
New Yorkers.
Yeah.
You can almost imagine it. And I can imagine my response being the same to Stephen Covey's, where he's sitting there at 7 o'clock in the morning. He's a little bit tired, just waking up. And there's this guy with his kids, and his kids are beyond rambunctious. they're literally running amok. They're running on top of the seats. They're throwing the newspapers, because back in the day when we actually had newspapers, it was almost like this unwritten rule. You would leave your paper on the seat, and it wasn't being discourteous. You're leaving it for the next person. Well, they were throwing the newspapers up in the air, and finally Stephen Covey can't stand it anymore. He's just bubbling up with what an inconsiderate father this is. He says, hey, you think you might want to do something about your kids? And the dad, almost as if he's snapping out of a trance, just wakes up. He's like, yeah, oh my God, you're probably right about that. Sorry, we just got back from the hospital. Their mother just died an hour ago, and they don't know how to handle it. And I'm not sure I do either. And right there, he realized that his base assumptions were completely incorrect. And that is a great example of a fundamental attribution error. People are usually the experts on themselves. You do not know more about somebody else, why they do what it is that they do, better than they do. And the difference between a coaching-based culture and a self-help-based culture, and by the way, I think they are both highly valuable in the right context, but one's hierarchical, it's top down. The other one is not necessarily putting the right information in, it's drawing the answers out.
Mm. So this podcast is about helping people have access to not just information, but tools to apply it. And I think I was looking over your website, and that's one of your main objectives. If this podcast is somebody's listening to it and they've been on, they feel like they need to get healthier or wanted to lose weight, or they got their blood work back and there's some key markers they need to work on, and they've gone to the gym and I'm going to bring it to fitness. I know that's not your main realm right now. But that's majority, I'm thinking of the podcast or our listeners. And they want to find out ways that they can take all this abundance of information that's out there, because there is a lot on what to eat, what not to eat, being present, not being present, nervous. There's so much out there. If somebody was just starting in this journey, what would be some things that you would do to coach them through an obstacle? Let's just say, and I'm going to bring it to the simple one, they haven't been able to lose weight. How would your coaching guide this individual on the really simple basis?
Well, that's a common goal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth pointing out that if you look at the stats that are released by the National Institutes of Health, for every person that says they want to lose weight, over 97% either fail to lose the weight or fail to keep it off for a span of 5 years, which is how they measure long-term adherence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the questions we're tempted to ask is, what is wrong with over 97% of us? We have this goal and we can't seem to achieve it. I think a more constructive question
Mm-hmm.
might be, what's right with the 3%? What are the 3% doing that the other 97% are not doing? And just to simplify it, whenever you're working with anyone, there are 4 critical steps that I think is necessary if you're going to support long-term adherence. The first step is moving off of the problem, which sounds counterintuitive.
Okay.
Well, I need to lose weight, and therefore I'm going to employ these weight loss strategies. And that's all well and good, but the problem arises when things get really hard, and they inevitably will. So the first thing you have to determine is not the weight loss, but what are your values? And when I talk about values, I'm not talking about social contracts. Like most of the time when you ask somebody, well, what do you value? They're like, well, I value integrity and I value honesty and not lying. I think, what other alternatives were you possibly considering? When I'm talking about values, I mean, think about the greatest time in your life when you felt most engaged, most fulfilled, most alive. And usually those are the times in your life where you disappear. When you're having the time of your life with someone you really want to be doing something with, and it's the exact thing that aligns with your values, you're not even aware that you're having a good time until you reflect on it after the fact. Like if you're a writer, when you're caught in the act of writing, you're not even aware that you're writing. You disappear. You lose track of space and time. That's kind of like what Mahadi Csikszentmihalyi was talking about in his book, Flow. It's that point of engagement that's so deep and so rich that you disappear. And the only time you show up is where something goes wrong. Somebody rings the buzzer on your door, or you mess up in a paragraph and then you're like, and then whatever sentence comes after that, that's you showing up in the middle of that moment. What are those flow inducing moments when you look back in your life? What are the moments that you're going to treasure most? Why? Start with your values, because when it comes to values in the long run, we kind of align with things that support our values, and we kind of move away from things that don't align with our values. And it's like, we all know that story about the kid who was a musician, and their whole life they just wanted to play music and be in a band, but they couldn't do that because their family had a law firm, and dad was an attorney and granddad was an attorney, and that's what you're going to be. And you try to wage this war against what you value versus what you're supposed to do. And then you reach your 40s, you have a midlife crisis, you go out and you need to buy a Porsche. So the first thing is, what do I value? Second thing is, how does that show up 1 year from now? If I'm living in alignment with my values, what does good look like? And I'm not talking about conceptually. I'm talking about once you lose that weight, what are you doing differently that you're not currently doing that gives you life? Or what do you no longer have to endure that you hate having to endure? The third step is, what are the outcomes that need to arise in order for me to get to that goal? So if you have a 20-pound weight loss goal, you're not just going to wake up one day and lose 20 pounds. In case you do, unless you do something radical like with a chainsaw, which is not recommended. So there are certain outcomes that need to occur, outcome goals, in order to get you there. And then the fourth step are, what are the behaviors? What are the behavioral goals that bring about the outcomes that allow you to live your vision so you can live a life in alignment with your values? Because that's where a lot of resilience is going to come from. I'm not saying that is the source of resilience, but it definitely influences resilience. If you break things down in that way, when things don't work out, which is a lot of the time, you're not overwhelmed by success versus failure, because you're breaking down specific variables and rituals. So in other words, I'm going to go to this is something that the fitness industry was going on about for a while. Do you remember the just eat less and move more? Do you remember that movement?
Oh, it's so easy.
How hard could it be? Just eat less and move more. That is the same scenario as
Right.
me working at the Y as a lifeguard. And I look up and someone's drowning in the middle of the pool. And I run to the edge of the pool and I scream out, "Hey, drown less, swim more." Now, technically, that's good advice, but it's not actionable, and it's not going to get someone out of the pool. So if you say you're going to go to the gym, what exactly does that look like? When? What are the acute variables? What exactly are you going to do? At what intensity? How many days a week? What are your support structures? Who's that person in your life that whenever you're trying to do something good for yourself, they're your biggest fan? How can you enroll them? How could you take them out to a cup of coffee and talk to them about your goal? So what exactly are you doing? So on a Wednesday afternoon at 5 p.m., when you're supposed to be heading to the gym and something goes wrong, it's not like I failed. It's one variable that you need to manipulate and you can learn from. Because when you have specific rituals and routines and models for doing what you say you're going to do, it's the things that don't work out for you that gives you the information, that gives you the adaptability to move forward and move further than you ever would have been able to move if you didn't have that quote unquote failure happen anyway. I might need to know something that I need to organize the pickup for our kid with my spouse because sometimes they don't get out of school when they're supposed to get out of school, or I can't go pick them up because I have a meeting. I have to stay late. I might have to coordinate with somebody, but I don't learn that until something goes wrong. And most of the time, people think that when you're setting out to achieve a goal, the worst thing that can happen is you fail. No, sometimes that's the very best thing that can happen. Here's the worst thing that can happen. And this isn't about weight loss. This is about anything. You have the best workout at the gym you've ever had. You get up in front of the board and you make the best presentation you've ever made. You go out on a date and it's the best date you've ever had. And you have no idea why. And you can never reproduce that. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. And that's what a habit model and a structure can do for you. Because even when you get to the behavioral goals, which is step 4, there are steps within that. I like to use acronyms for everything because I had a hard time learning things when I was growing up because I've had over 10 concussions, been put on experimental medication, Tourette's. So I have a lot of brain damage. So when I was younger, I was like, well, how do I learn anything? And for me, acronyms created these mental models. And one of those models is what I call a core habit cycle. No matter who you read, whether you're reading James Clear, BJ Fogg, whether you're reading The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, all great resources, they all have a model. And it works around something like this. There's a cue, there's a behavior, and a reward. The core habit cycle incorporates other models of coaching into your typical habit cycle. And here's how it looks. Number 1 is the C, cue. What are your environmental cues or triggers? So one of the things that comes out of self-help, and it's not wrong, but it's not completely true, is everything comes down to making better decisions. If you did something, well, that's because you made a bad decision. Well, going back to the 1980s with Benjamin LeBay, when he was doing his research on compliance with simple requests like, hey, would you raise your right hand? And he would get 100% compliance. He would hook these subjects up to an EEG. And what he noticed within the brain scan was to a lot of requests that he was making, the motor cortex would fire before the prefrontal lobes. And what does that mean? What that means was our brain decided before we were even consciously aware that we were complying. So how can you make better decisions if you're not even consciously aware of the behaviors you're engaging in because of operant conditioning and your response to environmental cues that are below your conscious awareness? How do you make a better decision around that? What you need to do is start saying, well, what are some of these cues? And an example is, let's say I decide I'm going to do yoga every day after work. And that's probably not a bad idea because I'm about as flexible as a crowbar. So it wouldn't be the worst decision I've ever made.
Right.
But I walk into my house and the first thing that's there in my living room is the TV and the remote and the sofa. Well, all of those are environmental triggers.
Got it.
Kind of like a stop sign. You don't read, oh, wow, S-T-O-P. Well, I think they want me to slow down and stop here. You just respond to your conditioning of that environmental cue, or at least you probably should. If you live in San Diego, you just like slow down, roll right through it. That's your conditioning, but most people should stop. So what do? I'm on the couch, turning on the TV. I don't even know why I'm doing that. I never made a conscious decision. I just responded to those 3 environmental triggers. But now I have to rationalize, why am I doing what I'm doing? I said yoga. Now I'm sitting here watching TV. Oh, yeah, you know what? Let me unplug and disconnect for 5 minutes. But then I turn on the History Channel and they're telling me that aliens might have built the Great Pyramids. Holy shit. I got to see how this thing unfolds. Now I'm in front of the TV for an hour. I start repeating my old patterns. So one thing that you might want to do is, what are competing environmental triggers that serve your intention? So I might want to put the TV away in a cupboard. I might want to take that remote and put it into a place where I really have to go looking for it intentionally. So there's a wedge between stimulus and response. And what I might want to do is lay out a yoga mat right in the middle of my floor, first thing. So now I have that environmental trigger that supports the behavior I want to engage in, and I'm minimizing or eliminating even the environmental triggers that work against my intentions. Second thing is, before you do this, let's observe a couple of things. On a scale from 1 to 10, when you get into coaching practices like motivational interviewing, scaling is really clear to elicit specificity and also to create a path forward through deeper understanding of where you're at. On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being this is absolutely critical. Why am I doing what I'm doing? How much does yoga play into my highest values? And let's say my highest values are experiences and love of learning and sharing. And I've been wanting to go exercise or go on these hikes with my wife and get to the top of a mountain, overlook the ocean, because these are moments and memories that I know when I'm sitting in a rocking chair, when I'm 80 years old, if I live that long, I'm going to cherish that. but I can't go because I'm constantly injured. I have overuse injuries. And I'm always saying, oh, you know what? In a couple of weeks, time is fleeting. So it's a 10 for me. Okay. Then on another scale from 1 to 10, how confident am I that given my goal, I will do yoga, 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? How confident am I knowing my past behavior patterns? And if it's anything less than an 8, how do I reduce the size of my goals? Maybe it's not an hour. Maybe if I just start out 3 days a week, 20 minutes a day, I feel that's more palatable. It's not where I want to be, but if I get going, what the research from James Petraska, and he's one of the pioneers behind the trans-theoretical model of change, what that research tells me is if I can successfully set and complete any goal that I have for myself, my chances of being able to follow through with a secondary supportive larger goal doubles. So it doesn't matter where you get started. It's a matter of consistency and follow through. So that scale becomes important.
Bobby, I love speaking with you because you bring a whole other layer to coaching. We've interviewed a lot of incredible holistic health wellness coaches, and I think your layer brings, if I can describe it, like a really raw, like let's get to the root cause, like without any fluff. And I feel like your questions have always been really powerful. And one of the things I've noticed. So thank you for sharing those steps on what somebody can do. One of the things I've noticed is when I've set you up with, I've had you speak to a couple of my clients. One particularly is a high level entrepreneur, executive, and he's been having or had trouble or issues with weight loss. He would go up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And I share this story a lot with people, and you were the one person to really make it connect for him. And you ask the right questions. When you talked to, how did you know, you can share a little bit about the story because I think it's really powerful, but how do you know what questions somebody needs to ask themselves? Or is that, how did you know that about him? Is it is it a magic talent?
No, I'm so glad. I am so glad you asked me this question. When you look at coaching, one of the popularized myths around coaching, and people will say this so often, it sounds so intuitively correct, but it's only partially correct at best. Coaching is about asking really great questions. No, it's not. If that was the case, you could read a book, 10 best questions to ask anyone. I'm sure there's 1,000 books out there with that. And you can write them down and email them, and you're done with coaching. Or you can get a 9-year-old to memorize those questions and say, when you sit down in front of this person, ask this question, followed by this question. These are really great questions. And now you have your 9-year-old coach. It's not about asking really great questions. It's about the response to the questions. It's about reflection and affirmation and encapsulation. When you ask a question that either you have a model, there's somewhere you're looking to go with someone, so there's a coaching model, or you're listening and following your curiosity, it doesn't matter if every question is particularly insightful or genius. What matters is that you listen to the response. What are they saying? What are they not saying? What words? My coach, Dave, he would call this a sandwich word. What's there that really catches your attention where you're like, wait, what? There's an emotional emphasis on it, or it just doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the context. That's something that I would be curious about. It's where their body language shifts and changes instantly, whether it's the shape, whether it's the distance from you, whether they lean back, lean forward, what's happening? And what is it that you're noticing? What do you think you're observing? And leave your opinions out of it. What's your observation based on the response? And also, what are their strengths? What are their attributes? When you're talking about this particular client, who I remember this coaching session very well, what are their attributes that make them good at what they're good at? Or it's the core of who they are. And everyone around them is like, wow, you're really great at this. Well, how can we overlay those attributes in that area of your life to what you're trying to achieve, but you might be struggling in this area? Like if we can talk about your client
Yeah.
without mentioning any
No.
names, this person is someone who is struggling to adhere to exercise, constantly late, missing appointments, non-compliance. And what traditional self-help would say is you either need to expand your commitment and your discipline, or you need to shrink the size of your goals. You need to make a decision and just do the work. It's like, wait, hold on. This person is so successful in business, he's definitely part of the 1%. So someone who has been able to build multiple businesses and developed a reputation in each of those fields for outright excellence is non-committal and lazy? Are you joking? Something's not right. Like anyone who's had a business that's even been moderately successful knows it's one of the hardest things you'll ever do, and your chances of succeeding are very unlikely. Small Business Administration says that 95% of all businesses will go out of business in 5 years. The vast majority of those within the first year. You're talking about someone who has been extraordinarily successful in multiple businesses, top of the stratosphere, multiple times over. Something's wrong. And what appreciative inquiry, which is a discipline of coaching, would look at is not what are you doing wrong? What are you doing really right? What are your strengths? What are your attributes? So what I did, and I just asked him because I'm curious, what is it that you're most proud of? What have you been able to build that other people, despite their greatest efforts and sincerity, struggle to? Walk me through that. How are you able to do that? What are the beliefs you have? What are the rituals you have? What are the practices you have? On a scale from 1 to 10, how well do you think those are working? Definitely 8 or above, maybe 10. Okay, well, why do they work? If you were going to use those principles to teach me about weight loss, how'd you go about it? Forget the weight loss. Teaching weight loss through your principles. How would your daily routines and attitudes work for me? Okay, great. Well, how do you think those could work for you? That's what I was curious about, because what was happening and the rationale that this person was giving themselves in their head, their own self-talk about why this was occurring, was incongruent with so many areas of excellence in this person's life, because they weren't just really successful at business. Turns out, they were really a dedicated dad, loved their family. So still in the midst of being super successful at business, you had this other area of motivation where their values lived and they worked really hard. I don't buy that you're lazy.
Yeah, and
There's
you
a
know what? He
conflict.
went right to a spreadsheet and started applying everything.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So thank you.
That's
I feel like,
hilarious.
when it comes to certain clients, they go beautifully with your coaching. I think all clients do. And I know you're very much entrenched in leadership development with these principles. I know you're a very sought after speaker on behavior change and leadership. And some of the things you said, I just want to recap because we do need to end in a little bit. I know we have a time crunch that we're going for. But, one of the things that you brought up was definitely environmental cues. A common thread in a lot of our talks has been like, set your routine up, night routine, morning routine, so taking a look at your environment. And if somebody wants to get up and exercise in the morning, where are your exercise clothes? Like, are they laid out? Things like that. Setting certain movement practices. So I think that really ties into a lot of the tools that we can use to start applying this. And I also like how you talked about focusing, I guess, on talents, right? And this is something I've learned from you. A lot of times we'll do like an inventory. And this is a 10, let's say 1 to 10. 10 I'm great at. 2, this is a 2 or 3. This area of my life is an 8 or 9. This area of my life, and we go on our own judgment scale and we start at the lowest number. How can I improve this number? And I love your approach on what are you really good at? What is a 9 or 10 in your life? And how can we apply that to other areas. So focusing on the positives of somebody and not really making them feel like this area is lacking. And, it's helped me a lot in my life as well. So I wanted to bring that out. Did you have any comments on that? Because I know that you talked about that with the client that I referred to you.
Well, I think it's how we frame things sometimes that gets us into trouble, because the question that has been posed is, well, if you're looking at the positive, what about self-accountability? Well, what are you accountable for? Are you accountable to continually inward directed virtue signaling, or are you accountable to a result and an outcome?
Right.
And if you say you're accountable to an outcome, that requires a process. And how you leverage that process has an enormous amount of influence on the outcome itself. So let's say we'll go with the yoga example, because why not, right? I say I'm going to do that 5 days a week. And at the end of the week, I miss 2 days. What do most people focus on? They don't focus on what happened the days they followed through. They focused on what happened the days where what they thought was going to have happened didn't happen. And that is useful. But if you say, well, I just failed at yoga, and it's just this blanket generalization, you don't learn anything. And you start to reinforce the thought patterns that lead to recidivism, that lead to relapse, that lead to you just basically giving up. A better question is, if Thursday I completely screwed up and nothing that I said was going to happen actually happened, a good question might be, what was my best day? What was a day that, even though it was hard, I still followed through and kept my commitment? What were the variables? What was my environment like? What was my emotional state like? Who might have influenced that? You're going to learn a lot of information that helps you drive greater levels of consistency. And if you just stay in it, that means greater levels of success in the long term. You have to take a look at the best of.
Right.
So what percentage of success would you give yourself? And if it's like, well, I failed 0, 1, that's dishonest. Because if you're going to look at what you could have done better, you also have to be honest enough to look at what you did particularly well. And if you look at the 60%, you could say, okay, what would 70% look like this week? Now you're getting into strategy, because behaviors are the single most pervasive way to drive transformation. It's behaviors. You can get out on I live across the street from Padre Stadium, Petco, right? And somebody can have a really bad game, and the coach is probably not going to pull them over in the major leagues and go, listen, you got to believe, you got to be confident. All of these things work, but what are the specific behaviors that produce that outcome? If I'm a Major League Baseball player and I'm having kind of like a bad streak, I'm in a slum, and I go to my coach, and my coach says, listen, Bobby, what you got to do is you got to make contact between the bat and the ball more of the time. Again, that's true, but useless information. What are the behaviors that's going to facilitate that outcome? Even if it's a mindset issue, there are certain behaviors and practices that are going to shift that mindset. Telling me not to have a certain mindset or embrace a different mindset is wishful thinking. And it's generally useless.
I love the approach. I really do. And I think it's going to help a lot of people. I know you're currently right now working with companies and teams. Do you still do one-on-one coaching for the lucky few?
Very, very little.
Okay.
I will do it if there's a need, but I try to stay away from one-on-one coaching.
Where can somebody access your information? I know you're a speaker. Where can somebody access it at the Self-Help Antidote if they wanted to find out more? I know you have a podcast as well. And you also do speaking.
Same title.
Okay, great. And you also do speaking engagements for teams and companies. Is there anything else?
I do.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
No, because as we've already established, I can go on. I could just go off on one.
I know.
So I know time's a concern. So I'll just say thank you to your listeners.
Yeah.
Thanks
No,
for
I
having me, Natania.
definitely want to bring you back and talk a little bit more about, the process and just apply it to, different different areas and avenues of life that we have on the podcast, because we're bringing in body work, mindset, and movement. And I know mindset's a huge piece in applying all of it. So look forward to definitely bringing you back. And thank you for your time, Bobby.
Thank you.
Okay.